talking about Chapter 19, Section 1 of the Cold War, Part 1. Primarily speaking, with this section, we'll be looking at the objectives of both the Soviet Union as well as the United States as far as ensuring freedom and their own economic agendas. Any questions before we start? Perfect. Okay? A few things we need to analyze is the most immediate priorities. Okay? At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union possessed control over much of Eastern Europe. So obviously we're going to keep referring to that, and eventually we're going to retitle Eastern Europe to something different. But nonetheless, this is due partly because this will fail of Nazi Germany. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, there are two major things that the Soviet Union has going for them in World War I. What are they? Anyone know?
Their army is huge.
Their army is massive by personnel, so they have large numbers. Okay, another thing that they're going to have the assistance of.
A two-front war?
Mother Nature, very good. Okay, winter itself specifically. Okay,
oh, yeah,
and you'll be able to see that if you analyze both World War I and World War II as far as why Germany wasn't unable to take the Soviet Union. Now, many historians pose the question, well, what if, instead of focusing west, Nazi Germany would have never signed Brest-Litovsk with the Soviet Union and just pushed completely east? We could have an entirely red, for example, an entirely red East Asia and Asia, okay, as far as the spread of communism. Now, the immediate Soviet priorities: economic rehabilitation and military defense. So money and defense, that's what we're looking at here. Reconstruction of the economy. Soviets demanded Germany pay $20 billion in war reparations, so payment for damages. All right? The United States also promised initially large loans to them. Those will not be forthcoming as they agreed upon on paper. Military competition. Soviets sought to remain on par, the United States, at least keep up, okay, resulted in a nuclear arms and space race. Obviously, the space race will define the Cold War in its entirety. Okay, as far as who will ultimately win that will be the United States. Okay, but nonetheless, those two specifically will be the focus of the Cold War. Self-defense. Soviets wanted to make certain they no longer would be surrounded by countries hostile to USSR. So that meaning West capitalism. Okay, write that down. Western capitalist nations are primarily those who are hostile to the goals of the Soviet Union. So we're talking France, Britain, the Netherlands, and then obviously way across the lake, the United States. So nonetheless, we're going to create the Soviet bloc of nations in Eastern Europe under what is called what? Anyone know what the agreement was to establish this buffer zone? Starts with a W. Capital Poland. Warsaw Pact, very good. Okay, Warsaw Pact.
I knew it was that.
Okay, that's how they're going to achieve that, the Warsaw Pact. The United States deeply concerned that war-torn nations of Europe will go to Soviet communism. That's our fear here. Okay. That being said, we're going to go ahead and try to systematically approach this whole issue in both Europe and the Middle East as far as trying to ensure that this doesn't happen. We're going to help Shah Reza Pahlavi, presented here, okay, in Iran, overthrow the government to ensure that we maintain our Western oil initiatives. All right. So that being said, not the people's choice. However, he is USA's choice. And USA must be victorious. All over oil. Okay? Now, obviously, that's going to define relations in the Caribbean as well as in South America. What leader, regardless of political affiliation and support of his population, will support the United States the best and not be communist? Okay? That's where we are at right now in global affairs. Moving forward here. Immediate post-war period, the United States sought to achieve the following: reconstruction of Europe. Now, specifically, the nations that can afford to pay us back, such as France, Great Britain, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, etc. All right, be able to repay war debts. If you can't repay a loan and the nation defaults, you don't collect anything. If they can repay at least something, our profit margins rise. All right, economically stable Western Europe. Benefit the U.S. economy by importing goods. So stable Western Europe. That's a big one. If you are still ravaged by war and struggling to survive, you can't purchase U.S. consumer goods. We need to get you all into that position in order for that to take place. Alright? Eschew policies and political systems anti-ethical to U.S. post-war economic, etc., etc. Not communist. That's what we must make sure. Okay? We want to make sure that these nations do not adopt socialist and communist governments, particularly those modeled on the Soviet Union. Okay? We'll ultimately lose China to communism. We want to make sure that we don't lose all of Europe to communism. Military superiority, achieved through nuclear monopoly initially, then later through superiority, because the USSR will develop nuclear technology. All right? They do have official tests presented to you in Siberia. We just need to make sure that we have more than them. And what? Ultimately, now that many nations during this time period, especially now, are popping up with having nuclear warheads, what's most important after that? You have the bomb. Now what do you need to make sure that you're still number one?
More bombs.
Not necessarily more bombs.
Allies.
What's that?
Allies.
Oh. Delivery systems. Okay, that's the big thing that's going on right now with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Can they reach the United States? And if they can, specifically, what will they actually be able to attack? If you have a delivery system that you're able to launch, an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, from one city all the way across an ocean and attack another target, you are far superior than someone who has the same missile but must travel across the Atlantic to do so. Does that make sense? That's the ultimate goal then, all right? Containment of Soviet-backed communism, most important, all right? As far as maintaining that these nations do not become communist through the Soviet Union, all right? And that will define our foreign policy as we look at Korea, as we look at Vietnam, as we look at China, all of those nations. Continuing on. Perspectives on whose fault this is, all right? Whether it's the Soviet Union or the United States. Now, what does the icon here at the Soviet Union mean? We have symbols.
That they're
What the sickle means, agriculture, and the hammer.
The star, pride, power, and government. So the sickle means what?
Agriculture.
Agriculture, and the hammer?
Industry.
Industry, very good. And the sickle and hammer, agriculture and industry. Those are the goals. And that's essentially, in any economy globally, what you need in order to be prosperous. Perspective one. The ideology at the center of the conflict is to blame. No matter what. The United States and Soviet Union cannot get along because they're ideologically incompatible. One communist, one capitalist. So you have com v cap. If one believes that a more government-controlled and people-owned entirely means of production is the best economically, is the best socially, politically, you can't even begin to entertain the idea of a free market system. It's just incompatible. That's why perspective one, Cold War starts. Perspective two, merely an objective for each power to enhance national interests. So these two nations are acting appropriately. They both want to expand and they both want to be powerful. That's why the Cold War started. Perspective two. Okay? Now with expansion, you have to also underline or circle this. Mistrust. That's a big idea there. If you cannot trust another nation, you must instantly try to be better than them. For example, you and your neighbor, you don't get along, you don't see eye to eye, you don't trust them. What do? You build a fence.
Yep.
Okay? What else do? You might get a dog. You don't trust what they're doing, you protect your interests. Same thing here, these two countries are just acting appropriately. I don't trust the Soviet Union, we need more nuclear warheads in case something happens. They don't trust us, vice versa, same theory. Okay? That reflects in the Baruch Plan rejected by the Soviets who may have mistrusted American intentions, believing the plan was an attempt to thwart the goal of nuclear parity. Okay, so that's the big idea. Why is the Baruch Plan mistrusting? Because we are trying to reduce or slow down their nuclear development. We do not want them to have it, so we're going to go ahead and try to ensure that that happens. Perspective three, the onus, or the reason, the impetus, for the start of the Cold War rests with both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Still both people's fault. Cold War could have been prevented if not for misperceptions, misguided idealism, and unfounded suspicions. If both of these two countries were truly clear on their goals and initiatives on the global spectrum, this wouldn't have happened. if the Soviet Union would have been clear and outright said to us and President Truman as well as Congress at the time at the end of World War II, they have no interest in Africa, they have no interest in expanding further than the Middle East, this may have never happened. If they would have, on paper, promised we never plan to invade nor bomb you, this may have never happened. But still, we don't have that component of trust. Ever since FDR and Stalin, will meet at Yalta, not at all. Not going to happen. Okay? Perspective 4. Place the responsibility in the Cold War with us. Okay? 4 equals us. Tensions between the two nations started when the U.S. revealed counter-revolutionary tendencies during the Russian Civil War, when we supported the wrong side. Okay? Russian Civil War, we are with this person, not the Bolshevik Party. As soon as we formed the wrong alliance and the other side won, the Bolshevik Revolution takes place, Lenin takes control of the government. That's what many people would believe when the Cold War started. Okay? They can't trust us. They'll fight in a war with us to ensure that we're not all part of the Nazi Germany Axis powers, but beyond that, they're not going to support us. Okay? Continuing on. Cold War in Europe. Yalta Conference, February 1945, Big Three. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Stalin convinced Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would help end the war in Japan, in the East, in return for reinstatement of pre-Russo-Japanese war status. That being said here, no matter what, if we win the conflict, VE Day, Victory in Europe, if that takes place, they will then reallocate all of their forces towards Japan. Because obviously, if you're familiar with the geography and the demography of the Soviet Union, almost all of the population and their government centers are where?
In the East.
In the East. Or excuse me, not in the East, in the West.
Yeah, that's
right.
West.
Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
Western Asia.
Yeah, like
I see where you're at. Okay? But nonetheless, if Nazi Germany is right there, knocking on the door, we need to make sure that they're out of the conflict before we can move anything to the east. U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union with French participation, divide and administer Germany. This is where we have Eastern and Western Germany, between the USSR as well as the United States. But this is, again, elevates the Cold War. Several post-war concessions left unsolved, leaving both the Eastern European section, the Soviet Union, to solve them themselves, v. West, which is mainly us. Okay? When these concessions are unsolved, we ultimately take our own agenda. As far as, number one of the most important ideas, what do we do about these freed countries in Eastern Europe? How do we determine popular sovereignty? How do we determine free will? Any of that. We didn't have anything on paper for that. So Stalin says, you know what, guys, I got this. Okay, I got this. And he's going to go the route with elections. We're going to host elections in these countries. So we're looking at Poland. We're looking at all of the Balkan nations. Okay? All of Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, the Ukraine. We'll host elections. But he's also going to make sure that the Stalin-supported communists will take all of the nation's elections. Okay? Forming the Soviet bloc, which you guys see here. Now, the whole idea with this, if you just look at this, you split right down the side here, West, East, Russia, or the Soviet Union. Okay? What's the most important reason we have these?
Have what?
What would the most important reason be for Stalin and the Soviet Union to ensure that they have this block of nations right here?
So we have time to react to each other.
We, as the Soviets, have time to react if Western powers take over. For example, look at how Germany has acted in both World War I and World War II. Contractual promises with the Soviet Union they won't attack. In both wars, they attacked the Soviet Union. It makes sense that the Soviet Union doesn't trust anyone. We've had agreements before with other countries, and both times they've fallen out. The Schlieffen plan to avoid a two-front war by maintaining peace with then Russia, okay, in World War I. Brest-Litovsk, keeping the Soviet Union out of this conflict. Nullified. Once the Berlin air raids, London air raids, the round-the-clock systematic bombing of the UK by the Nazi war machine fails at taking that country, Nazi Germany, Hitler, has to turn east to take the Soviet Union. At that point, that trust is gone. Okay? So you have to understand, as far as the Cold War, Russia is absolutely on par with that component of mistrust. Why would you trust anyone? Okay? Anyways, continue on. The long-term necessity that we have here at the Soviet Union. All right, protection of its vulnerable western border from invasions by creating a buffer zone. That's what we have here. That's the most important thing here. You guys will laugh, but the movie Euro Trip, anyone ever seen that? When they get lost in Europe or Eastern Europe, okay, and everything looks like it's just ran down and destroyed, that's because the Soviet-backed government essentially does not care. Does that make sense?
Have you ever seen
no
Rollerball?
money was poured into that eastern bloc of nations to ensure that Poland rises back to how it was historically, or the Ukraine, or Bulgaria, or any of those. No money's there. They're just X amount of miles to the Soviet Union. You were gonna say something?
Rollerball, have you ever seen that? It's got they have a part where it's like a really aggressive sport where it's roller rink and they have like a ball and they try to it's like near Russia and stuff like that, and it shows this part where they're driving around in their rich cars and stuff, and then you just have this whole riot in the streets and everyone burns everything pretty much, and it looks like it's all in Russia and stuff.
Yeah, and still to this day, these nations truly haven't recovered entirely to